Ladies and gentlemen, can we come to order, please? Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute and to the February installment of our monthly Bradley Lecture Series. I invite all present to return next month when, on March 10th, Professor John Tomasi of Brown University will lecture on F.A. Hayek, Spontaneous Order, and the Mirage of Social Justice. This evening I'm delighted to welcome to AEI for the first time Lawrence Krauss of Case Western Reserve University, where since 1993 he has been Swayze Professor of Physics and also Professor of Astronomy, Chairman of the Physics Department for more than 20 years, and since 2005, Director of the Center for Education and Research in Cosmology and Astrophysics. Professor Krauss earned his PhD in physics from MIT in 1982. Thereafter, he spent several years as a member of the Harvard Society of Fellows. He taught and did research in the physics and astronomy departments at Harvard and Yale for several years before joining Case Western. His particular field, well known to AEI audiences, is that of particle astrophysics, which is concerned with the interaction of physical phenomena at extremes of scale and of time, such as, for example, the implications for cosmology of the behavior of fundamental particles, and on the other hand, what the remnants of the Big Bang may have to teach us about the mysteries of particle behavior today. He is the author of more than 200 scientific papers and has also become a well-known author of popular science books, many of them bestsellers and award winners, including The Physics of Star Trek in 1996, more recently Atom, a single oxygen atom's journey from the Big Bang to life on Earth and beyond, and his most recent, in 2005, Hiding in the Mirror, the mysterious allure of extra dimensions from Plato to string theory and beyond. Professor Krauss also contributes frequently radio commentaries and op-ed essays on science, politics, and public policy. And while we had urged him to lecture this evening on particle astrophysics, he has chosen instead to talk about these latter topics. His title is Science versus Anti-Science, From Washington to the Classroom. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Lawrence Krauss.
Thank you. You got that right about particle astrophysics. I was pretty impressed. Yeah, well, I won't lecture about that, although I'll be happy to answer questions afterwards about that or anything, or Star Trek if you wish. But I'm going to deal with the real universe, which is sometimes a little more difficult. This is the American Enterprise Institute, so I thought I'd begin with economics. And to me, science and economics are tied to culture, and I want to talk about the cultural problem of science in this country. And so I thought I'd tie it to economics in perhaps a way that was brought home to me a few years ago when a friend of mine came back from England and pointed out to me the 10-pound note. On the back of the 10-pound note is a picture of Charles Darwin. Okay? On the back of the dollar bill is a pyramid with an eye. And I think that gives a sense of the cultural difference between the two countries that I'm going to talk about. That's some of the problems. Now, I'm going to, as I talk in some sense about attacks on science, and I want to, again, begin on economics at least here, and talk about the fact and remind some of you that science is of vital importance for our current standard of living. Lots of economists have done studies and have suggested that the rate of return for scientific investments is incredibly large, and have suggested at least half of the nation's growth in GDP per capita during the last half-century has been attributed to scientific and engineering achievements. And it will be vitally important, I will argue, for the next generation that we continue that, but that's under siege. As you also know, so many people were concerned about this that the National Academy of Sciences produced a report which gained a lot of strength in Washington called Rising Above the Gathering Storm, where they said without a renewed effort to bolster the foundations of our competitiveness, we can expect to lose our privileged position. And that, through a series of events, ended up being manifest in the America Competes Act, which was passed in 2007, which suggested and proposed an increase in funding for fundamental research of basically doubling it over the next 7 years. Now, the Gathering Storm argument was concerned about a number of things, and in fact in a follow-up report also largely authored by Norm Augustine called Falling Off the Flat Earth, I think. There are several statistics that are rather discouraging, that the World Economic Forum dropped the U.S. from 1st to 7th place in ranking of nations' preparedness to benefit from advances in information technology. U.S. companies spent 3 times more on litigation than on research, which is suggestive. Over the past 20 years, the number of engineers, physical scientists, and mathematicians graduating with bachelor's degrees in the U.S. has declined by 18%. PhDs in engineering declining by 25%. And adjusting for inflation, the U.S. has spent about 1/5 less on research in the year 2000 than it did 15 years ago. So that has been declining, and that's of concern to a lot of people, including me. Now, in the midst of all this, we have great problems with a number of different areas that I want to talk about. So I'm going to first talk about problems and then talk about some of the issues. And science education is certainly a problem in this country. U.S. 12th grade, you can pick your favorite statistic, and I pick a random one to depress me in different ways each week. But U.S. 12th graders recently performed well below the international average for 21 countries, and you'll see that the countries we perform below are not necessarily the peak, the cream of the crop. And if you look at the number of our undergraduates going into science and engineering compared to, say, Japan and China, it's also discouraging. 66% of undergraduates go into science and engineering in Japan, 59% in China, and 32% in the United States. This is, by the way, that recent study that showed we scored well below the rest of the world internationally. I don't know if you can see this, but the interesting thing is they studied 4th graders, 8th graders, and 15th graders. And for 4th graders and 8th graders, we actually perform above the international average in both science and math. These are the U.S. here, and this is the international average. But we do something to them, so that by the time they're 15-year-olds, they're performing well below the international average. And it's by no means homogeneous in the United States. If you look at the scores for 15-year-olds, you'll see that it varies greatly by states. Here are various U.S. states compared to various countries, and you'll see that Mississippi is slightly above Egypt. Massachusetts, which scores higher, is nevertheless well below, in fact, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. So no American state can compete with those countries in Asia in terms of education of science for middle school students. Now, it gets worse as people grow up. And every year the National Science Foundation does a study of scientific literacy. And I collect them and look at them periodically. Here are some recent ones. It's a 2001 study. It's more recent. A new one just appeared, in fact, but I thought I'd use this one because it has something I want to say. So in the study, 53% of American adults were unaware that the last dinosaur died before the first human arose. That may not be so surprising. The next one is the one that always surprises me. 50% of American adults knew that the Earth orbits the Sun and takes a year to do it. Now, when I saw that, I thought it was a trick question. So I went to the study. The study said, the Earth orbits the Sun and takes a year to do it, true or false? Okay. And absolutely every year that it's been performed, half of the American public get that wrong. I could make a political statement, but I'm not going to. It was, however, a landmark year in 2001 because it was the first year that more than 50% of American adults claimed to know that human beings, as we know them today, developed from earlier species of animals. That was the first time more than 50% of American adults had agreed with that statement. It didn't last long, and if you've read any recent surveys, here's a recent one, for example. 60% of U.S. adults surveyed in April 2007 stated their belief that God created humans in their present form less than 10,000 years ago. 60% of American adults, in spite of the fact that that is false. It's not arguable. There's no debate. It's nonsense. Okay? Now, this scientific ignorance is unfortunately, in my experience, compounded by journalists, many of whom are quite uncomfortable on matters of science. I interact with a lot of journalists. I have great respect for journalists. It's a difficult task. But it is rather surprising to see the hesitancy that journalists will use when discussing matters of science as compared to history or economics, where they might ask probing questions or disagree with the speaker. But in matters of science, there's great hesitancy. And I again, can relay interesting stories of interviews with anchors about various issues that I won't, but I'll be happy to talk about in the question period if you want. In fact, many journalists have told me that if it had not been for a physics class, at some point they would have done something else. So that they're very uncomfortable, and that journalism itself, in fact, I would argue, has an inherent tension built into it that makes it very difficult to cover science. And that's because journalists are really trained to look for the fact that there are always two sides to every story. And they work very hard to try and find those two sides. But what is profoundly important about science, in fact, what makes science largely unique in human intellectual endeavors, is that most times in science one side is just wrong. And that's really important. Because if that weren't the case, if one side wasn't unambiguously wrong, we couldn't make progress. In fact, that's what science is all about. Science can never prove anything to be right. It can only prove things to be wrong. And the great thing is, once they're wrong, we throw them out. We don't have to talk about them anymore. We don't need creative thinking classes to discuss whether the Earth is flat, or to debate that issue, or whether the Earth is 6,000 years old, or any of the other things that we know to be wrong. And that is the way science makes progress. But because of the fact that journalists really always have to try and find another side to a story, most reporting does not reflect that. Because, of course, you can find a PhD to say absolutely anything you want. And so if you are looking at any issue and reporting on any issue, you can always find someone to disagree with it. And then if you quote one person on one side and one person on the other, it gives the impression, of course, that there's a controversy. And I'll talk about artificial controversies that have existed in this country on various issues, when really, in fact, there's no controversy at all. Now, on top of education, we have this problem. I was, as you heard, chair of the physics department at Case Western Reserve for many years. I got this video catalog, and it's the kind of thing that is sent to many high school science teachers and middle school science teachers to help make their classes interesting. A lot of middle school science teachers need that because in this country, approximately 90% of middle school science teachers have never taken a science course beyond high school. Okay? They're the ones who are teaching our children. And so they need props. And this is, I'm all in favor of things that make science interesting. The interesting thing is when I got this catalog, and this is really for me, I don't think you'll be able to read it, but I'll read it out to you. This is page 71, said Mysteries of Science. And in the center there is a National Geographic video, Mysteries of Mankind. So it seems like a reasonable set of videos to show the class. Let's look what the other videos are. Bermuda Triangle. Bermuda Triangle Secrets Revealed. Nostradamus. One could go on. My favorite two in the end, there's Loch Ness Monster. And the last one, of course, Loch Ness Discovered. And so the point is, if you don't have a filter, if you're a middle school science teacher and you don't have a filter, and this seems reasonable, then so do these. And so the nonsense continues at all stages that people are barraged with. And that is a huge problem, because if people don't have the filter to distinguish sense from nonsense in science, that, as I will argue, is in fact a huge problem for our democracy. Oh, I guess I'll go back there. Okay. In fact, I'll argue about it now. I'm a scientist, so I care about these things. But why should we care if we screw up the science? Okay? I would argue that it is vitally important that we not screw up the science, because once we blur the truth in one domain, one important domain of public discourse, once we allow nonsense to stand with impunity in one key area of human activity, I believe we've jeopardized the very basis of a healthy democracy. In particular, now more than ever, because scientific issues form the basis, I would argue, of almost every important political decision that's going to be made in the next decade. Now, Science, I think, is relevant for democracy in another sense. This is a quote from one of my favorite physicists, Richard Feynman. Some of you may have heard of him. And I'll read it to you. The only way to have real success in science is to describe the evidence very carefully, without regard to the way you feel it should be. If you have a theory, you must try and explain what's good about it and what's bad about it equally. In science, you learn a kind of sort of standard integrity and honesty, whether you want to or not. And the idea of not cherry-picking data, the idea of looking at things that disagree with your a priori ideas, is incredibly important, and I would argue incredibly rare in many places, including this city. The ethos of science, I would argue, depends on honesty, as I just said, creativity, open-mindedness in a way that I'll describe momentarily, full disclosure, reporting all of the data, and my favorite, which is anti-authoritarianism. There are no scientific authorities. There's no such thing. They're scientific experts. But there's no one whose word is not subject to questioning by the lowliest, you pick it, graduate student, whatever you want. And that is incredibly important in science, that anyone can question and everyone should continue to question. Now, these issues have become particularly important in the last decade or so as science has become increasingly politicized. I have a quote here, actually, from George H.W. Bush to the National Academy of Sciences in 1990. And he said, "Science, like any field of endeavor, relies on freedom of inquiry. And one of the hallmarks of that freedom is objectivity. Now more than ever, on issues ranging from climate change to AIDS research to genetic engineering to food additives, government relies on the impartial perspective of science for guidance." That, I believe, is a perfect statement of what the relationship between science and government should be. That has changed somewhat in the intervening 17 years. Here was a statement, for example, by the press secretary of our current president, who says, "This administration looks at the facts and reviews the best available science based on what's right for the American people." Do you detect the slight difference? You decide what's right, you pick the science that's based on that, and that's what you use. And that's exactly the kind of cherry picking that science is supposed to be not about at all. And I want to talk about my concerns about that in a variety of areas. Now, there are 4 examples I want to talk about. In fact, there's a lot more that I'd like to talk about in the next 3 or 4 hours, but I'm not going to talk that long, so that's good. But I think I'll refer to a few, just to give you a sense and hopefully provoke some of you in one way or another. So I'll talk about sex education, I'll talk about missile defense, intelligent design, and I'd like to talk about global warming, because I'm sure I'd like to refute things that may have been said in this very room, in fact. And I will be happy to talk about it in the question period, but in order to keep my remarks down, I've decided to remove that, because that's an issue we've heard a lot about in one way or another. And I want to just present these because they're 3 very different examples of fuzzy thinking, in my opinion. Thinking which, if we thought like scientists should think, a lot of these issues would at least, I think, be clearer, or the important things that should be the basis of public policy would be clear. And I want to make that statement very important right at the outset. Scientists should not be making public policy. But policymakers should be informed by science. And that's the important thing. So let's pick one example, which is abstinence-only education. It's been around, mandated in one form or another since 1996 in this country. I would call it faith-based science, and by faith-based I don't mean religious. Okay, it's based on the faith that somehow abstinence-only education will help. And this has been monitored. In particular, the Center for Disease Control ran a program that was called Programs That Work. And they analyzed and tried to do studies of sex education programs that worked in the schools. And they focused on 5 programs, if you read their website in 2001, that were found effective in scientific studies in sex education. None of those at the time, by the way, involved abstinence only. Importantly, and of great concern to a number of us, in 2002, the Programs That Work initiative was ended. And all the information that had been gleaned on sex education programs was removed from that site. And one of the reasons it was removed is that abstinence only became the policy of our government. Now, in fact, in the next year, Ari Fleischer stated, "Abstinence is more than sound science. It has a proven track record." At the time, it wasn't clear where it was proven, but more recently, it's been quite proven to the contrary. A very large study was just done in April 2007 following kids for 10 years, 2,000 children. And a number of conclusions were drawn. First of all, students who took abstinence-only courses were no more or no less likely to abstain from sex than other students. Abstinence only did not change the likelihood of condom usage. It did not make it worse, which some people had claimed, to be fair. And the conclusion of the study was the most effective those that say abstinence is the best choice, misspelling, but birth control and protection are also worth knowing about. Okay, not too surprising, perhaps. That was in April 2007. Okay, this should tell us something about what we fund. Congress in October 2007 agreed to increase money for abstinence-only education by $28 million. We now spend a total of about $200 million a year for a program with no scientific basis. In the United States, we should remember, we have the highest teenage pregnancy rate in the developed world, about the same as Ukraine's, it turns out. The highest abortion rate in the Western world. Sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea are on the rise for the first time since the 1980s. I mention this because I find this unbelievably offensive. I have a daughter, among other things. And the thought that some a priori notion about what we should be doing is more important than doing something that could save the lives and health and well-being of our children is something that sickens me. Let me now move to another subject, missile defense. As you know, missile defense has actually been around for a long time. And it's a good idea. I mean, President Reagan proposed that the scientific community created nuclear weapons, and why not create a method to make them obsolete? And if I wrote about Star Trek, I'm contractually obliged to mention it. Any good starship on Starship, on Star Trek always has a shield. It's a great idea if you can make it. It's absolutely a good idea if you can make it. And you argue that, and it's important, given where we are, the spirit of American enterprise, nothing is impossible. Now, in fact, I would argue that the notion that nothing is impossible also runs counter to the way science is really framed. Science is all about what's impossible. As I told you, what's possible we don't know, but what's impossible we often do. And missile defense is an area where scientists in particular have spoken out a lot over the years about the difficulties and particularly the logical inconsistencies of missile defense. One of the examples that's often used when we talk nowadays in this presidential campaign, you'll hear people say about the spirit of American enterprise and how we were able to send a man to the moon. We can do anything. Well, the important thing was pointed out by at least one person is the moon didn't try and stop us. If it had moved 5 feet, that would have been a disaster. Okay? And when we're trying to engage in missile defense, we're actually going to be trying to defend ourselves against missiles, and presumably the people who are sending the missiles at us actually don't want us to hit the missiles. And that's an important issue, which I probably won't have enough time to get into today. It's one of the main things that concerns physicists, is the fact that in general, offensive weapons are much cheaper to build than defensive weapons. And in fact, this can be proliferating. But I don't want to get into that subject that much, because you might say that's controversial. I want to talk about something else which shouldn't be controversial. And in 2002, the American Physical Society, which represents scientists of all political persuasions from this country and elsewhere, proposed made a radical statement, revolutionary statement. They passed a resolution calling on the government to delay deployment of a missile defense system until it was demonstrated to be workable against a reasonable threat. So they said, don't deploy it till it works. What a novel idea. Okay? Now, in fact, it turned out that more than 50% of the U.S. public already thought we had a missile defense system in place at the time, maybe the same 50%. I would argue that, in fact, that we should have kept that and not spent the money. I mean, just saying we had one in place is as good as having one that doesn't work. In fact, better. In 2003, our administration officials told the Senate that interceptors capable of shooting down enemy missiles with a 90% efficiency would be in place by September 2004. Okay? In spite of the fact that the systems that had been built failed in a majority of the tests that had been performed at that time, and none of the tests, in fact, involved realistic decoys or any of the things one would expect anyone that was shooting a weapon at us would use. But we decided by fiat that this system would be workable and in place. Now, what are you going to do if you're the Pentagon and you're told that a system is going to be in place by 2004 when it's failed the tests? Well, quite simply, the easiest thing to do is stop testing. So that's what the Pentagon did. After that statement, the Pentagon stopped all testing of missile defense systems, because after all, they'd been failing much of the time, until the system was deployed. Now, I ask you, we're allowing our government to do that. Let's just think of private enterprise for a moment. Would it be acceptable for General Motors to begin marketing a new SUV when trials have shown that 60% of the time it toppled over when turning a curve at greater than 50 miles per hour? Well, maybe we'd let General Motors do that. But would it be acceptable, say, in your neighborhood to build a nuclear power plant if in the prototypes there was a 60% failure rate? Would we allow that? I mean, and the point is, this is just going to kill a few people. This may take out just a city. But we're talking about our national defense. We're talking about the defense of this country, and now we're talking about the defense of other countries. And we're willing to allow the kind of sloppy thinking to deploy a system that doesn't work and claim it does. We're allowing our government to do things that we never allow, in my mind, private industry to do. Now, it was declared operational in September 2004. And you may remember in the campaign we were told that it was operational and our enemies could shoot at us and we'd protect ourselves. 8 silos have been deployed. By the way, all told over the years, since before the ABM Treaty was signed in 1972, we spent, it's estimated, about $600 billion on missile defense. Okay? And we don't have a system that works. And I would argue, along with other people, that there is no workable missile defense system. But aside from that, the system that exists right now certainly doesn't work. No tests were done for over 2 years. And then, since those, there's been a 50% success rate in the rigged tests that have been done since then. By rigged, I mean, in general, we can hit a missile 50% of the time when we know where it's coming from, where it's launched, and what its trajectory is. So if we're fortunate enough to be informed of these things in advance, in an actual wartime situation, we'll have a 50-50 chance. Now, in fact, this alone, by the way, and I actually had a slide of numbers, but I decided to remove it. But if you work this out, if you assume a 60% success rate, you have to ask yourself, I'll say this because I think it's really important. If we had a 60% success rate, how many missiles would you have to send to this country to have a 95% chance of having one hit? Well, you need 5. Okay? So, if you're a country, and nuclear weapons, once you know how to build them, are actually relatively cheap. They're certainly cheaper than the $10 billion a year we spend on missile defense to produce a system that doesn't work. But you've got to ask yourself, from a proliferation perspective, if you're a country that can produce 1 weapon or 10 weapons, can you produce 50 weapons? And if we have a missile defense system that we claim to be 50% effective, what are we encouraging those countries to do? But the worst part about it is we've made this unsuccessful missile defense system a part of our foreign policy. We not only want to defend this country with a system that doesn't work against a threat which at this point is non-existent, but we want to defend other countries. And we're creating diplomatic problems in Europe by wanting to put a similar missile defense system, an equally unworkable missile defense system, in Poland. Anyway, I think I've talked about those 2 issues. And hopefully I've... the last thing I want to say is, you have to ask yourself, what's the strategic purpose of a ballistic missile defense system? See, ballistic is the important word. I'm a physicist. What does ballistic mean? It means it's like a baseball. Okay? It follows the laws of physics. You shoot it up and it comes down. And the great thing about ballistic means, when you shoot it up and it comes down, you can figure out where it came from. So any country that wants to attack us with a nuclear weapon is marking their country with a big X. Okay? You've got to ask yourself, is that more likely a possibility to spend $600 billion on versus the possibility that a country would want to smuggle a nuclear device in this country through a cargo container in a port, where if it explodes, you have no idea where it came from. So this great emphasis to spend all this money on ballistic missile defense has not clearly got a good strategic purpose. Certainly, by the way, at the present time, there are no countries that just have a few weapons that can send a ballistic missile towards us now anyway. Okay, now, if I didn't offend people with missile defense, let me try here, because religion's always a good way to do it. Religion and science have had an uneasy truce over the years at various times. And an example where they collided was in 2001 in Afghanistan. This was before September 11th, when the Taliban were in control, and we're not our avowed enemies at that time. But you may remember the famous and tragic example of these statues of Buddha, these almost 2,000-year-old statues, which are a treasure for all humankind. And the Taliban at the time had decided that in their interpretation of the Quran, no images of human faces should be allowed. And so all statues in the country were going to be destroyed. And they would start with these. And there was an international outcry, and unfortunately they were destroyed. We don't have them. And it was a loss for humanity, and certainly for the science of archaeology. At the same time in this country, at the exact same time in this country, then House Majority Leader Tom DeLay, who by the way has a degree in biology, put into the congressional record the following statement, that the Columbine school shootings occurred in part, quote unquote, because our school systems teach our children that they're nothing but glorified apes who have evolutionized out of some primordial mud. So evolution is responsible for the Columbine school shootings. Okay? Now, there is a huge confusion about evolution in this country, which I want to talk about a little bit. And the confusion goes all the way to the top. The person who should be defining public policy, in this case our president. And President Bush, as you know, in 2005 said both sides ought to be properly taught. He was referring to evolution and something called intelligent design, so that people can understand what the debate is all about. Now, this intrinsically is not a stupid statement. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, if there are two sides. And that's the problem. This represents ignorance, scientific ignorance, because there are not two sides to this debate. There's one manufactured side that doesn't exist in the real world, outside of the media. Now, just to make it clear, and I'd be happy to give a lecture on evolutionary biology, but I'm not going to, but I should make the point that evolution is probably the most successful and impressive scientific theory of all time. It has been tested over and over and over again by all the hallmarks that make good science, by observation, prediction, and testing. It's predicted experiments that have gone out and been performed and agreed with the predictions. And I see my friend Walter Isaacson's in the audience, and he and I and all of us physicists have done this job on you, and we've convinced you Einstein is the greatest scientist of all time. And because, you know, us physicists are certainly the most pompous and obnoxious of all scientists. But you know, having studied this a lot, I think there's a really good statement, and we just haven't done the right kind of publicity campaign for Charles Darwin. Because if you think of any individual in some way who's changed science more than anyone else, I think there's even more than Newton perhaps, Charles Darwin, a single individual who amassed the data and the theory to change the way we think about life on this planet, it's truly remarkable. And we should really hail him instead of relegating him perhaps to the second tier, and in fact in this country to derision. Now, what's intelligent design? That's a really good question. There's no good answer. And there's no good answer because it hasn't been subject to peer review and testing, like evolution. And I was going to have a slide going into the various versions of it, but the really important thing about intelligent design is the following. It's simply opposed to evolution. Intelligent design is an umbrella for all those groups that in one way or another are opposed to evolution. And the really important question in this country is, why are people opposed to evolution? That's the question that's baffled me and got me involved in this whole issue. And I think the answer, and the reason I as a physicist have gotten involved in this, is that it's really, evolution is a straw man. This is really based on a fear of science. A fear, in particular, that because science does not explicitly mention God, science is inherently immoral. And I'll give you an example. Here's a statement from what used to be on the web pages of something now called the Discovery Institute, which claims to be a scientific organization, at least the part of it that talks about this. It used to be, this part of the Discovery Institute, what used to be called the Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture, but that was kind of emotionally charged, so they've gotten rid of the word renewal. And in 1998, they put a document that they said the proposition that human beings are created in the image of God is one of the bedrock principles on which Western civilization was built. This cardinal idea came under wholesale attack, drawing on the discoveries of modern science. The Discovery Institute Center seeks nothing less than the overthrow of materialism and its cultural legacies. And it had some goals. The goals were to defeat materialism and its destructive moral, cultural, and political legacies. This is a group nowadays in which, if you hear, you'll hear them say, we're just interested in good science, and evolution isn't good science. But they've decided in advance that it's bad science because it's immoral. And to replace materialistic explanations with a theistic understanding. And their goal, in fact, was to begin attacking science teaching in the public schools in 5 years. In my own state of Ohio, within 5 years, that's precisely what happened. And that's how I got involved in this particular debate, as they tried to introduce the notion of intelligent design, whatever that was. Now, this notion that science is immoral is everywhere. And here's an example taken from one document, which is evolution, which is based on Satan. And it's responsible for all the bad things in our society, including humanism, which is evil, divorce, euthanasia, homosexuality, pornography, abortion, racism. I don't know what that one was. And it is, of course, just working to destroy the basis of Christianity. That science is a force for evil. And evolution is just one particularly easy straw man because it involves the notion of us and whether we're special on Earth in a particular way. Now, this is not just bad science. This is ridiculous theology. That's the other thing that's worth pointing out. It's a disservice to all people of faith to imply that it's better for our children to remain ignorant of the world than to risk the possibility that knowledge may somehow undermine their faith. That, I would argue, is in fact what we're fighting in Afghanistan. And I want to just touch on this for a moment, this question of God and science. I'd be happy to talk about it a lot more because I've thought a lot about it. But the important thing is, while there is an inherent tension, and my friend Steve Weinberg has said it very well, I think, by saying that science doesn't make it impossible to believe in God. It just makes it possible to not believe in God. And that's a true statement. Before science, everything is a miracle. Once you have science, you have the option of assuming that there's nothing but physical causes for physical effects. That's an option. But it's not a requirement. And that's very important. And the example I want to use, in fact, I will talk about cosmology for 1 or 2 minutes. My favorite example involves Georges Lemaitre, who was a Belgian priest, who was also a cosmologist, a physicist. And he was, in fact, the first person to solve Einstein's equations for an expanding universe and show there had to be a Big Bang. And Einstein, in fact, didn't believe it and derided him for a while, but much to his credit, Einstein eventually realized he was right. And Lemaitre showed there had to be a Big Bang. There was a beginning to the universe. That was a profound shift in science. Up to that point, the scientific consensus was that the universe had been around forever. It was static and eternal. Suddenly it had a beginning. At that time, Pope Pius got very excited by that fact and wrote a public statement that science had proved Genesis. Now, what did Lemaitre do? Lemaitre was a priest. He wrote to the Pope and said, stop saying that. This is a scientific theory, and it makes predictions that can be tested. Now, if your religious and metaphysical beliefs suggest to you that it provides a vindication of Genesis, fine. But it could also equally well tell you that you just have the laws of physics that take you back to t equals 0 and you don't need anything else. What you take out of the theory depends upon your religious beliefs. But whether or not you believe in God, the Big Bang really happened. And the same is true for evolution. Whether or not you believe in God, evolution really happened. Now, I want to just spend the last few minutes talking about why ID has been so successful, and then go to some problems in Washington today. And I think it's been so successful. In fact, it's won the hearts and minds of the people in this country because it involved a very good public relations strategy. The idea of open-mindedness. How should we be so closed-minded just to talk about evolution in the schools? Let's be honest about the fact that most people in this country don't believe in evolution, which is a true statement. Most people in this country don't believe evolution. And let's be fair and allow those people a fair say in classrooms. Now, I would argue that what the public and what policymakers should see is exactly the opposite. This is closed-minded, it's dishonest, and it's unfair. It's already closed-minded. I've already shown you the Discovery Institute's open-mindedness. Science is immoral, therefore evolution must be wrong. That's not open-mindedness. Open-mindedness is forcing your beliefs to conform to the evidence of reality instead of the other way around. It's also dishonest. What's the controversy? What's the controversy? Well, when I started to debate them about the controversy, I had a colleague look at a survey of over 10 million articles in over 20 major science journals during the past 12 years. We hit the keywords evolution. 115,000 articles came up, and we didn't do an exhaustive study, but most of them referred to biological evolution. Hit the keywords intelligent design. 88 articles appeared. However, all but 11 of these were in engineering journals where there's supposed to be intelligent design. And of the remaining 11, 8 were in fact critical of the scientific basis of intelligent design, and the remaining 3 were in fact in research journals. They were in conference proceedings. There's no controversy in the scientific literature. Now, when I bring this up in debates, I'm told, well, of course, that's because scientists censor. We don't allow this to be discussed in the scientific literature. And I've given out a challenge which no one has yet to win. I've challenged any of them to argue that they've been rejected from scientific journals more frequently than I have. And no one has won that yet. But instead I said, okay, look, you know, they said, well, we produce books. Darwin produced a book, so we produce books. Well, Darwin also produced articles. But I went to the unpeer-reviewed literature, and I went to Amazon.com, and I did the same thing. I hit the keyword evolution. I came up with 21,822 books and articles on evolution, most referred to biological evolution. I hit intelligent design. I got 635 hits. Now, about half of these were, in fact, engineering books, leaving about 300 left, and half of the remaining 300 were critical of intelligent design, leaving about 150 books and articles on intelligent design. Just for fun, I hit the keywords alien abduction. Okay? I got just as many books. So if there's a controversy that we should be teaching in our schools, if we're going to be teaching about intelligent design, we should be teaching about alien abduction. It's just as controversial. Now, it's not only dishonest, but it's unfair. And this is really the key point. Here's how science is done, sometimes. If you're lucky, you have a novel scientific claim. Then you do research, and as Feynman said, you do research trying to prove the claim true and false. Then if you're convinced it's not false, you submit it to a journal and you send it out for peer review. What does that mean? You send it out to idiots. And these people cannot understand what you write. And they come back with silly reasons why it didn't make sense. And you write back a response using short words. And then eventually, if you're lucky, it gets published. But big deal, there's lots of garbage that gets published in the scientific literature. That doesn't matter. What matters is if the idea is good enough that your colleagues start to think about it. And it builds up scientific consensus, and then maybe after 20 to 30 years it makes it into the high school classroom. That's why high school textbooks are always 20 to 30 years out of date. But what do the intelligent design advocates want? Well, they just want to get rid of the intermediate steps. Okay? They want to go directly from some ill-formed idea to the high school textbooks without doing any of the other steps. And if they really do believe it's science, they have an obligation to play on the same playing field as scientists. Now, here's an argument that has been resonated with a lot of people. Look, at least 50% of the people in this country don't believe in evolution. So shouldn't we really be introducing it in the science school classrooms? Now, I want to remind you of that National Science Foundation survey result. 50% of American adults apparently think the sun goes around the Earth. Therefore, should we be teaching the Earth-centric cosmology and physics classes in high school? After all, 50% of the people seem to think it works that way. When you point it that way, the answer is obvious. And the key point that seems to be missed from this whole debate is the important point that the purpose of education is actually not to validate ignorance, but to overcome it. And so if 50% of the people in this country don't know that the Earth orbits the sun, we're doing a crummy job teaching it. If more than 50% of the people in this country don't believe in evolution, we're doing a crummy job teaching it. We shouldn't do a worse job. This should motivate us to do a better job. Now, as my friend Eugenie Scott from the National Center for Science Education has said, the First Amendment protects against the government establishment of religion, but that doesn't mean it will protect against bad science. We have to protect against bad science, but in fact, recently, the First Amendment has done a pretty good job, as you all know about the Dover case, which has really dealt a huge blow to intelligent design in this country. And many people would say, okay, this debate is over, but it isn't. I recommend you read this, by the way, from Judge Jones, this decision. You can get it on the web by Kitzmiller et al. It's 136 pages, triple-spaced. And it's humorous and cogent and probably, in my mind, gives the best summary of the history and the science associated with this popular debate in this country over the last 50 years. But while this case was decisive and has been very important in my own state and other states in terms of keeping science teaching about science, the issue is by no means over. So in fact, here I just turned on the TV the other day and here's what I saw. As many of you may know, this is an advertisement for the Creation Museum, a young Earth Creation Museum near Cincinnati. $27 million museum built with zero debt, which claims to show the scientific story for a young Earth, a six-day creation 6,000 years ago. It shows dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden. They're vegetarian before the fall, in case you're wondering. And the interesting thing is that this was built in, it was chosen to be in Cincinnati because it was within a day's drive, about half of the American populace. And the interesting thing is they hope to get 250,000 people in the first year. In the first 3 months, they got 300,000 people that visit this museum. It's incredibly popular. But not only is it popular there, and in fact, one has to worry about what's happening in government. And I want to, in the last few minutes, mention more recent concerns about what's going, and then we can have some questions. As you know, in the Republican debate a few months ago, 3 candidates claimed not to believe in evolution, and at least one stated they were agnostic about the age of the Earth. In a subsequent debate, one of those candidates said that that was okay because he was not running for a middle school science curriculum developer. He was running for President of the United States. Now, that's not disturbing to me. The thing that's disturbing to me is that a poll of the public right after that, most people agreed with him. Most people said it really doesn't matter. And that's what should disturb. It disturbs me, and I think it should disturb all of us. Because, you know, it's fundamentally, and I want to get back to this economics in some sense, this is a question of economics and quality of life. And the interesting thing is, you know, when it comes down to it, ultimately, no matter what people say in a poll like that, when it comes down to dangers or their health, everyone realizes science is the way to go. I mean, take the avian flu. Okay, President Bush may have said both sides of the debate should be discussed. But when the avian flu came up as a threat, he, like everyone else, said we have to find out how fast it's mutating from birds to humans so we can attack it. You didn't hear one person say, you know, it's been designed to kill us, just give up. Okay? We have an inherent understanding that in situations like that, we have to depend on science. And we owe it to our children to give them the best science preparation we can give them so they can compete in the 21st century. It is our economic future. Science is a vital part of public policy, and people have to recognize that. And that is one of the reasons why I and several other people got involved in a proposal which has been building with great force to have a debate, a presidential science debate on science and technology policy. I've read this in a number of places, and I haven't verified it, so I must admit I say it with some trepidation. But apparently there was a study in 2007 of the 2,679 questions that TVS networks asked about presidential candidates. Of these questions, only 3 were about global warming, apparently. I've seen this in 4 different places. I can't verify that it's right. But apparently that's the same number of questions that were asked about UFOs. Now, this has caused a number of us, and a number of concerned citizens, not scientists. In fact, my co-organizers in this involve 2 screenwriters and 2 science bloggers, science journalists. And it is amazing to me. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal in December 6th. And since then, this has been sponsored by almost every major organization you can matter. And I certainly hope the American Enterprise Institute will become one of these organizations. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Council on Competitiveness, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, the Institute of Medicine, 100 leading American universities and other organizations, about 60 university presidents, 20 Nobel laureates, and now 14,000 concerned citizens, including science journalists and legislators, have signed on to endorse this. Most recently, well, and that we are all concerned that candidates' views on important policy issues, key important policy issues, are not being heard. Just today, Craig Barrett, the chair of Intel, signed on with a very strong statement about how we need to discuss science and technology policy if we're going to move forward in this country. And I want to emphasize, this will not be a science quiz. We're not going to ask what the 7th digit of pi is. Okay? This is, we hope to have a nonpartisan debate in which we want to know whether candidates have thought carefully about the public policy issues and what informs their thinking about issues that are important. Biofuels, which we just learned, of course, a lot of people are claiming we should be using biofuels, but as you know, recent evidence has been suggested that in fact they're worse for global warming. Manned space travel, a lot of people talked about the need to go to Mars. Well, what does that do for science? What does that do about unmanned satellites, for example, on Earth monitoring satellites, which are important to study global warming, where the costs are where those programs are being cut in order to produce manned space travel? What about nuclear power? What about waste associated with nuclear power? What about the financial viability of nuclear power versus, say, conservation? And what about American competitiveness, which I'll get to at the end here. And I want to give you some news. Just today, we've invited officially all 4 candidates, remaining candidates, to a debate which will be held on April 18th, 2008 in Philadelphia, and it's going to be hosted by the Franklin Institute, which seems an appropriate place to host it. Benjamin Franklin, one of the first great American scientists, to give you another plug, Walter. And the debate will occur if at least one candidate accepts. That formal invitation has now gone out, and we hope that all the candidates will accept, and we shall see. And when we get to American competitiveness, this is the last concern. As you probably know, in the omnibus budget passed by Congress in December, all of the American Competitiveness Act mandated increases in the physical sciences were removed. It's the 4th consecutive year of decrease in funding for basic research. This will produce, and already has, furloughed people at about 10% of the workforce at our major national laboratories. We've cut funding for the International Fusion Project, which we committed to. What does that do for our future international collaborations? And what funding remains is targeted for near-term applied research. And I want to point out the need to do basic research for our economic health. The example I picked is this one. You may not recognize it. It's from 1946. It's the ENIAC computer, which is a program plug-and-board switch computer. It was the fastest computer at the time, 5,000 times faster than any computer. Before that, in fact, it did 5,000 operations per second. Now, if we had invested money in building better computers at that time, and told Bell Laboratories, we want you to build better computers, we would have built machines that had faster cranks and wheels. Okay? What we did instead is we said, we want you to be free to investigate what you want and look at the quantum mechanical properties in nature. And what happened? They invented transistors. And the transistors now produce the most modern computers, which are approximately 1,000 billion times faster than that computer. Investments in fundamental research are responsible for the health of our economy today. And the investments that were not made last year, but 50 years ago. And if we don't invest in fundamental research now, our children will suffer because of it. And so, but I do want to conclude not with the autonomy. Because I don't want to make it seem as if science is just relevant for its technology. The universe is a remarkable place without all the junk. It is a truly remarkable place, and I believe the benefits of science are not just the ancillary technology, not just building a better toaster. I would argue we remember the Greeks and the Romans not because of their plumbing, but because of their ideas. And science brings wisdom by bringing knowledge, and more importantly for me, it brings wonder. And that is the real reason to support science in my mind. And I believe we need to be willing to accept the universe for what it is without fear, to build a truly just society and a safer and more secure world. And in that sense, science is not the enemy. And I should say faith is not the enemy. Ignorance is the enemy. Thank you. And I'm going to leave this up there, and you can ask me what that is. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions, and I assume I moderate them myself. Yes?
Thank you, Dr. Krauss. My name is Frank Fletcher. My question is fusion. What can you tell us about the future of fusion, and what are the barriers to making it viable, and specifically, and might it be overcome?
Well,
might they be overcome?
There's a famous statement about fusion that it's 25 years in the future. It was 25 years in the future, and it will be 25 years in the future. It is extremely hard to... We can create, as you know, uncontrolled fusion explosions. We call them thermonuclear weapons. Fusion is extremely difficult and expensive. And that was why, ultimately, it was decided to have an international collaboration, ITER, with an international competition, so that all countries could put together a single program to try and get controlled fusion devices. And the people working on that program are optimistic. I have no idea whether fusion is around the corner or not. And if it is, I should say I don't have any idea if it'll be economically viable. In my opinion, one of the big issues with nuclear power is not so much the dangers of nuclear power, which I think can be overcome largely with good engineering and good safety controls. It's the question of whether investing in huge central power plants that may require 10 or 20 years worth of capital investments is the way to go in the current environment. And so it's not clear to me that fusion will be financially viable. But one thing is clear, is that if it becomes viable, it is so profoundly useful because, of course, the byproducts are not going to be large isotope radioactive materials, and there won't be the waste disposal problem. That it is worth investigating. It is a huge challenge, and those are the kind of challenges we should have international collaborations to do. Just like we have the International Linear Collider as a proposal to investigate the forefront of matter, and right this, in a few months, the Large Hadron Collider is going to explore the fundamental structure of matter. These are the challenges we should take. In fact, I really wanted to say something that I forgot, and now you've given me the chance to say it. When we talk about science and its utility in this regard, be it fusion or particle accelerators, I like to remember the words of Robert Wilson, who was the first director of the Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory. And he was asked by Congress when that accelerator was being built, will it aid in the defense of the nation? And he said, no, but it'll help keep the nation worth defending. Okay? And that's why I think we have to do it. Because we can. Yes?
Thanks. Will Salatin from Slate Magazine. I'll pick fights with all three of your.
Oh, good. Well, I hope
points,
someone would.
But the third one is what really interests me. On abstinence, it sounded as though you pointed out that the data show that the study said that abstinence plus birth control seems to be the most effective program. So
Yeah.
I think you don't have a quarrel with abstinence as a component.
Oh,
Scientifically.
absolutely not. No, no.
Right.
It'd be silly.
On the second one, missile defense, I think you made the statement that there is no workable missile defense system. And I'm not sure you would want to make such a...
What do you mean? Well, what are you talking about?
Well, the notion of spending money on a program to find out whether it can work, you don't have a quarrel with that, right? So
I don't have a quarrel with spending money on a program that has a reasonable likelihood of working, yeah. But in fact, if you want to go into the technical problems, I think you could argue that there are much better ways to spend our defense dollars. But I don't have, research and development is not a problem of mine, and I think, we have a lot of money, and...
So it's just the deployment that you argue with.
Yeah, I think you shouldn't deploy something unless it works.
Right.
Just a little character
stage
thing.
you're fine with.
In principle, although I would argue that an honest debate about this would argue that there are in fact better ways to spend our money than on missile defense. I'd rather spend our money on making our ports more safe, for example. I think it's a much better, and it's much less money than the $10 billion we spend against this threat that I claim doesn't exist. Okay? So I think an informed discussion would argue that research and development could be spent a lot better on other things. But I have no problem with research and development and defense issues, no.
Okay, the third one, ID, that's kind of a no-brainer. I think you've definitely got that down. But on the question of, your argument was that debate over evolution affects our economy and our quality of life. Now, my problem with that is you cited two data points that seem to me to contradict that. One is that clearly the scientific journals don't take the debate seriously, so it's not a problem with science. Secondly, even the president, who supposedly doesn't believe in evolution, when it comes time to actually apply it to something like bird flu, does so. So that isn't the whole quarrel over evolution basically a little fairy tale that we tell ourselves that does not have any consequences for applying the theory of evolution broadly when it matters?
No, I think there's some sense to what you said. Evolution, in fact, there are I get letters from people who are doctors say, I don't believe in theory of evolution, but I can handle patients, And it's true that you can not believe something fundamental about science and still go on and behave, because people are amazing the way they can have two contradictory beliefs in their mind. In fact, most of us wouldn't be able to exist if we didn't, probably. But what worries me more is the public acceptance of agnosticism about something. If we publicly say it's okay to undermine some fundamental and profoundly important the basis of modern biology in our public statements, in our popular statements, what message does that give? And if we say, I'll be more explicit, if we say I'm agnostic about the age of the Earth, that implies that you're putting your beliefs above the empirical data. And that's the message I don't think we need to give to people, because I've seen, and I would argue, we've seen over and over, and particularly in the last 10 years, belief trump empirical data, and it's been it's hurt all of us. And so you're right. I think, evolution is a straw man in many places. It's got a lot of emotional energy and it's got a lot of intensity. But I would argue that the message it sends everyone, including students, is the wrong message. And at that level, at that very basic cultural level, it's extremely dangerous. Yeah? I'll get to you.
Hi, Richard Williams from George Mason University. I wonder if you'd like to comment on the fact that the pseudoscience isn't always necessarily benign, particularly in the 1920s and 30s in Germany with eugenics and so forth.
Well, I mean, absolutely. Pseudoscience is, I mean, at its best, it's laughable, and at its worst, it's extremely dangerous. And I would argue, I mean, I didn't think it was benign. I think my first example was a clear example of what I don't think is benign. I think absence only is pseudoscience at this point, and to require it because of some a priori moral judgment is criminal. Yeah?
After your previous examples, I'm curious about your take on global warming.
I have more slides on that, but I guess I'm not going to show them because I went on too long, but I'll give you the short version. The global warming is another example, less so now than it was, in my mind, at this point, well, a manufactured controversy in the last few years. The data, and I had a lot of data to show you, and it is really remarkable how we can study the temperature of the Earth over the last 450,000 years. And, well, you know, I guess I can't help it, though, show data. What can I do? Okay, I'm just going to show you a little bit of data. I'm going to skip this tirade against the current administration, but I want to show, I mean, you've seen this because you saw Al Gore, some of these movies, but the important thing is we can, what is a really useful piece of data that didn't exist a decade ago is the ice cores in Antarctica, allowing us to trace both the temperature of the Earth and the isotopic abundance back 450,000 years and probe the temperature of the Earth and the greenhouse gases and actually use physics to try and calculate it, try and make predictions for what those climate changes should be. And the point is, it's really kind of amazing how well we can do. And the important thing is that during that same period, we can also measure sea levels. And the sea levels varied by plus or minus 80 meters. We're not talking inches. And I want to go back to this data here. We are living in a time that is unprecedented, that has not the same as the planet. We are living in a different planet than has existed in the last 500,000 years. And it is absolutely true that we cannot predict what the future will be. We can make models that have levels of uncertainty. But one thing is clear, is that we are living in a different world. A world where all of the arguments suggest not only that global warming will happen, but sea level rise will happen. And in fact, if you look at the sea level rise in Greenland, in particular the melting of the Greenland ice sheets, it's far faster than the models predict. And the important thing about all of this is probably this, is the fact that all of the models suggest, and there's a great diversity in what they predict, but they all say we can't afford to wait to 2020 or 2030 to act. And so the point is, independent of your concerns, when you will remember when this administration went to the Supreme Court and fought against the EPA being able to regulate greenhouse gases. They made two statements, two of which I would argue are false. One is that trying to regulate greenhouse gases would have a negative effect on our economy. I don't know. Those are the same people who we're supposed to talk about American enterprise. It seems to me the great chance we have as a highly technological nation is to lead the world in finding new technological solutions to this problem. And one example is ozone. We solved that problem in a decade without destroying, I mean, it may have hurt the refrigerator industry for a while, but it didn't much. But the other problem is that because of the quote-unquote scientific uncertainty, we shouldn't act. And I think the point is that models are models, and I have complete agreement with the fact that there's uncertainties. But business as usual should not, when you look at those models, be viable. There's no good argument to wait to 2020 to act, because if you do, all the models argue that incredible damage is likely to result of that. And so the point, my argument is, I think most people are arguing, and we hear it from both sides of the aisle, that global warming is a problem. But what we don't hear people is saying we actually have to do something about it in the near term, that we can wait to deal with it for the next administration or for our children, and we can't. Okay, that's my statement of global warming. Yeah?
Oh, hi, I'm Kevin Finner, and I'm the editor of Issues in Science and Technology at the National Academy of Sciences. My question is, what are things that scientists say that make them sound like idiots?
Well, I said
some of these, I mean, what are the things that you think the science community does that, cause them problems for themselves?
Oh,
ways
sure.
which they go wrong, which make this debate and the separation of science and anti-science more troublesome than it should be.
Oh, sure. Well, I'll give you one clear example that I was going to talk about. You almost planted, as you were. Many scientists make the following statement. There is no evidence for God. And then they make the statement, there is no God. And that is one example of what's caused a lot of this problem, and why a lot of the people that I've debated who are quite earnest, who view science as dangerous, who view science as requiring you not to believe in God, because a lot of scientists say that. That is a misstatement. And I tried to give the example with Lement. As an old colleague Carl Sagan used to say, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And it may be that there is no need and no evidence for any supernatural phenomenon in the history of the universe back to the beginning. But to claim that that therefore implies there's no purpose to the universe is a metaphysical statement. It's not a scientific one. And I believe scientists err when they make that statement. I mean, making the statement is fine, but claiming that they have a scientific basis for that statement is doing much more harm than good, in my opinion. That's one example. I get to pick. I keep forgetting. Let's go to the back since your microphone is there, and we'll work our way forward.
Hi, I'm Joel Schwartzen with AEI, and like you, I share your pain about people not believing in evolution. I'm a scientist myself by training, but I became a policy wonk. And I used to send money to the National Center for Science Education because it pained me so much. But I stopped, and the reason I stopped was because I started to feel like, as painful as it is existentially, I wonder if it doesn't really matter all that much that people don't believe in evolution in terms of any sort of practical thing. You argue that it matters for our economy, our economic competitiveness, our wealth, but in fact, couldn't you say the observational evidence we have is just the opposite? That America is the wealthiest country on earth. We have the fastest economic growth. We develop most of the technological innovations in the world, even with a population where most people don't believe in evolution, and where people don't know that the Earth orbits the sun, and that the fact that people are ignorant many people are ignorant doesn't really affect the fact that we're able to generate wealth and create nice, good lives for ourselves.
Okay, well, no, that's a valid point, actually, I think. And there are a few responses that I'd make. First of all, as long as it is a true statement that if we have the best graduate schools in the world, and the United States, let's face it, our economy has relied on importing the best minds in the world and keeping some fraction of them here. Okay, some fraction go abroad. And as long as we can continue to do that, you're absolutely right. The question is, when do we stop being competitive in that regard? And that's of some concern to a number of us. If you look at the number of foreign graduate students that are applying to American universities, in some sense, that certainly went down after September 11th because we didn't let them in. But that's been declining. The ability to compete at the highest levels is of some concern. But then there's the other problem. I mean, it's true. We can have a permanent underclass in this country and maybe be fine. But at some level, it seems to me, if the future involves technology and high technology, and I happen to believe it does, the future economic health, those countries that invest in technology are going to be the economic leaders in the 21st century, I would argue. I think it's imperative to have a workforce that can handle that technology. And therefore, I think we owe it to ourselves and our children to do the best possible job we can educating them. I mean, I also recognize my bias. I'm an educator, and there's an old statement that if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And it's true. But I happen to think the solution to most things is education. But I don't see how we can argue that we are a great nation if we don't educate our people. And if we openly give up. You know, you're right. It's, at the end, there's going to be a group of people that are going to be really good, and there are going to be a group of people that are really rich, and it's going to be, you know, and it's not going to be that different than it is now. But it seems to me, if we really believe in what we're talking about, we owe it to our population to educate them. And moreover, just like we owe it to make them literate. I mean, what's the point of teaching them Shakespeare? I mean, that always amazes me. No one questions the need or the value of art or music or literature. Well, yeah, you're right. In fact, probably they do. They don't want to fund it. But science to me is just like art, music, and literature. It's a basic part of what makes us a civilized species. And some of these ideas are the most amazing ideas that humans have ever come up with. And it is sad to think that we would not want to convey those ideas and in fact, enhance our culture. So I guess that my argument is cultural rather than economic. Should I? Okay, one more there, and then we'll come up here.
Michael Novak at AEI. I think I agree with virtually everything you were intending to do, but I thought you made 7 or 8 very bad steps. That
Only 7 or 8? I thought you'd think more.
Well,
okay.
I'm trying not to take too much time.
Okay.
That really make your talk quite unpersuasive, and I think would to many, many audiences. First point is, I think the structure of your talk was essentially political. Economic benefit is the country, and you want to persuade the federal government and the American people to give more money to science for their own benefit. That's the way you structured it. Okay, but it is a political argument, not a scientific one. Second, you began early by pointing out that half the American people don't believe one fundamental part of scientific findings about evolution, about the age of the earth and about human beings and so forth. And that seems odd to me because certainly that's the only theory taught in the schools, from high school through college to university and so forth. So what is it about the way science is being presented that's just not persuading a lot of people? Oh. I think this follows on the question I asked just a minute ago. What is it that's off-putting? And here, let me make 2 or 3 suggestions and quit. One is you say science is essentially anti-authoritarian, but that's simply not true. We constantly have the need to defer to authorities in one science after another, which we simply don't have the time or energy to master. And you can't ask intelligent questions about materials that are way over your head. And you know, I mean that's.
I'm trying to think. I should make notes to answer all your questions.
Well, it's not going to be necessary. But let me conclude on these notes. I think scientists need to suggest what it is they're offering as a theory. I don't think it's really a matter of science, but nonetheless, scientists have a duty to do this. What is it that you tell the 50% of the people that don't believe in your most important finding here, gives meaning to their lives? And what is it you tell them that makes them believe that what you say are the fundamental values of science, honesty and creativity, have any meaning? Why not be dishonest? Why not be destructive in a world without meaning? And in other words, I think science is trying to do too much. It's trying to present itself implicitly, steadily, as a whole view of life, and it's just not. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm gone on too long.
Okay, well, you obviously had a lot of problems. So let me address a few of the things you talked about. I certainly didn't mean to give the. I began with economics. I don't think I ended with economics. I think I made the point that the economic argument is not the key argument. I began with economics because of this particular forum. I think it's important to realize that we need to spend money on fundamental research, and science is a vital part of the economy. But that was not the thrust of my talk. The thrust of my talk is that we have to begin to utilize science to make sensible public policy. And it is true that most people don't have the filters necessary to criticize experts, perhaps. But I tried to pick examples and utilize a principle that I learned from the publisher of the New York Times, who said, I like to keep an open mind, but not so open that my brains fall out. I think most people, and I'm convinced that if you give a very simple set of arguments, most people, if presented with the basic data, will make reasonable conclusions. I didn't present, I mean, maybe the global warming thing, which was the reason I kept out, was maybe the most sophisticated of those arguments. But the argument on missile defense is that you don't need to be a rocket scientist, forgive the pun, to recognize that you shouldn't deploy a system that doesn't work.
What if it worked politically? What if it really worked politically and it could work?
You know, you can make that argument. But if you make the argument, you should make that argument. I mean, I've always, I think, and I think you would agree with me here, from a moral perspective, I think you have an obligation to explain why you're doing what you're doing in a democracy. Maybe I would hope you would agree with that. And an ethical perspective, if not a moral one. And then let me get back to the problem that science has. And you really hit it. And I think the problem it has is, and that's why I had this nice quote from Einstein about mystery. Too often, you're right, science does not provide meaning for people, or awe, or a sense of wonder. And we do too poor a job of explaining it. Science is presented, mostly by science teachers who are uncomfortable with it, as being something you need to memorize or something you need to do to get a better job, or something like that. Science is not presented as something that provides not just amazing ideas, but a wonderful story, a story that, in fact, for many scientists competes with the Bible in a very effective way, to be blunt about it. And the problem is, and I've gone to a lot of fundamentalist colleges in this country, and I think I've had more impact there when I make the simple statement that you don't have to not believe in God to believe in evolution. And the reason I have an impact there is I have students come up to me that have told me their entire lives, every single Sunday, they've heard the opposite. So the problem science has is, first, that we're not doing a good enough job presenting the awe and wonder of science, but secondly, it is being attacked week in and week out by people who fear it. And against such an attack, the data has a very, when you tell people, if you accept this theory, you're not going to believe in God, people will turn their minds off. And young people especially will turn their minds off. And it's not surprising, therefore, that most people in this country don't believe in evolution, because they've been told a lie. And by the way, that's the reason I had this, that's the reason I had this picture here, by the way. And you should go to the web, go to NASA website. This is not a painting, this is a picture, this is a photograph from Cassini of Saturn. It's a total eclipse of the sun, a scene from Saturn. But the thing that's most amazing, and this projector doesn't have the resolution to see it, if you look at this picture, in that picture, right there, you'll see a little dot, a pale blue dot, which of course is the Earth. And it seems to me that is the wonder we should be telling our kids about, showing them pictures of understanding our place in the cosmos, the Earth, the center where all of our vital trials and tribulations and political battles and moral battles are being fought, is that little spot, that fragile spot in a dark void. I mean, that's the kind of story we should be telling to inspire our children. And I agree with you, we're not doing a good enough job doing it. Okay, I said I'd come to the front, so did you have a question or no? Okay, then we'll go you. Yes, okay.
Hi, I'm Nina Della Salas with the Council of Chief State School Officers, and definitely for better education. Just want to make a note, and someone else mentioned it earlier, about sometimes how scientists are kind of preventing the message. One of them is, I would say, the vocabulary that we use.
You're right.
One of the things I was cringing a little bit.
When I said believe?
When you said believe.
I always try not to do that. Yeah, I know.
Because, and I know this from, from my own personal perspective, faith and then science, you see it as two ways of knowing. And but when you start using words like, and especially when people don't understand theory, theory in layman's terms is totally different from a very concise explanation in a scientific world. And how we need to be more clear, and herein is where education is very critical, and a message getting across that this is a very precise meaning that we're providing for this.
You're absolutely right. We have to train ourselves, and that's part of the problem, by the way. I don't think scientists are very good. I've argued, but at one point I got a lot of flack by saying that we do a crummy job in public relations, and we should learn from public relations people, because the ID people certainly have. And scientists, what, public relations, sound bites? But, you know, unfortunately, I think if you want to get people interested, and I also happen to think, and I've just written recently about this in Scientific American, that teaching is seduction. I mean, everything is seduction. If you want to convince people, the biggest mistake any teacher makes is assuming their students care about what they say. Because the minute you make that assumption, you're lost. You have to drag them in to where you are. And I think scientists have to do a better job. And you're absolutely right. We have to be more careful about what we state. And so do journalists. And in fact, to respond to the other question, you're right. We tend to, maybe to some extent, sometimes give scientists too much authority when they don't need it. But if you look, for example, at the popular media's reporting on evolution, there's only one place I saw everywhere the statement is often made, most scientists believe in evolution, or something like that. There's only one, I saw one reporting by Corey Dean in the New York Times where she said, evolution is the basis of modern biology. Statement, a fact. We don't give scientists, too often we don't give because it is a series of facts. Evolution happened. It's not, you know, there's a theory of natural selection, but evolution happened. Yes, maybe two more or one more? You're the boss. Okay.
Thank you this evening. Speaking of your rhetoric and taking the temperature up a little bit, I think the comparison of the intelligent design people to the folks in Afghanistan might have been just a wee tad over the top.
I actually think Tom DeLay's statement is very similar, frankly. I would put it on the same level. But anyway.
Well, having heard George Gilder and John West here at this same table just a few months ago.
Not all the people, but there are statements.
And knowing that a lot of people scientifically, Pascal, Copernicus, Newton, Kepler, von Braun, recently were all faithful believers.
And Darwin too, by the way.
Okay, and Darwin. The suggestion being that it might be a little tough. I want to go back on one thing with the historical record. You were mentioning eugenics being a pseudoscience. In fact, wasn't it the scientific consensus of the community up till the advent of basically two words in world history, that being Adolf Hitler, and pushing the eugenics around, that was an example of scientific consensus pushing bad policy. And the only reason I'm bringing it up is that I think, going with what the one man was saying back here in part, we need to have some other things assist science as we're going forward in the policy realms, and that it not be the authoritarian thing. And I was just wondering your view on that.
Oh, that's the only thing you said that I agree with. I want to make this point. It's a good way to end it. I want to make it quite clear. Science should not define public policy. Science should inform public policy. So should other issues. I mean, we have lots of important, we're thinking beings in principle. There are lots of things that should come in to into determining public policy. And I do not think there should be a cadre of scientists that determine public policy. That would be the worst thing I could think about. What I want is that sound science be made available to the public and to legislators so that our democracy can function as well as it can. Thank you very much.